All right, y'all, it's about that time. Any opening questions or anything before we dive in? We've got a very interesting next few weeks here. Resurgence is the title for today, and we're going to be spending actually 3 weeks in this same time period. Some time periods are more fertile. The 300s, a lot was going on. We spent some time on that. The Reformation is certainly going to require multiple weeks in the 1500s. But the 3 centuries of a kind of 1000 to 1300 are also a very fertile period. It overlaps the secular period called the High Middle Ages. There was the early Middle Ages, which used to be called the Dark Ages, but they prefer early medieval, early Middle Age now. And then there's the late Middle Ages, which overlaps the Renaissance. But right now we're in the High Middle Ages. And the reason this is important is because there's so much going on in the church during this period. And as I said last week, I'm going to flip the order. I'm going to talk about universities and monasteries next week and talk about controversies and crusades the week after. But that word crusade should be a flag there. If a church, any church, can cause its society to go to war, that says something about the power that particular church has. So part of the reason we're going to talk about the High Middle Ages so much is because the church is having a huge resurgence in power in Western Europe. And at this time, if we're talking about the church in Western Europe, it's what will later be known as the Roman Catholic Church. This is before the Reformation, so we're still in that undivided Western church. East and West will have divided in this period. We'll talk about that momentarily. But really, this is the apex of political power for Christianity in Western Europe. Never before, never since has the church been this powerful. We'll talk about that. And there's good stuff with that, and there's plenty of bad stuff with that too. So we'll talk about that. So if we're resurging, that means we're coming back to kind of where we were and maybe even more after falling down. So what was that pattern? Well, remember, we talked about Western Christianity in the 400s to 600s. We talked about how as the Roman Empire fell apart in the West, the Bishop of Rome kind of stepped up in that vacuum to feed people, to import food into the city of Rome, and also started to gain some prestige, not necessarily political power as much at this point, amongst the rest of the area, Western Europe. And a lot of that prestige is granted by outsiders, especially Rome being a pilgrimage site. We talked about this. But that period, 400s to 600s, the Pope started making some claims, which, they kind of overshot the power they had. But their successors in the High Middle Ages would take up some of their arguments and say, oh, yeah, this is how it should be. So that was probably the high point up until this point. Then things kind of fell backwards for several centuries. Last week, we talked about the Holy Roman Empire and the fact that France could conquer northern Italy and Rome and claim it was Roman, and the fact that Germany could later take over that same area and claim it was Roman says something important. One, they think Rome has some prestige, but two, Rome has no power. If Germany can take you over and call itself Roman, or if France can take you over and call itself Roman, then they're wanting the prestige. It's kind of like Wells Fargo Bank. Wells Fargo's had so many mergers, but since Wells Fargo had a TV show and a song in the Music Man, every time they merged, the Wells Fargo name kept at the top of the letterhead, even though because it had the prestige. So Roman kind of functions the same way. They're not especially powerful at that point, but politically in Rome, but it still has some cachet to it. All right, so that brings us up to the High Middle Ages. And at this point, it's interesting. The map of Europe, which has been more fragmented, is starting to consolidate. You don't have to look carefully to see there are fewer nations on the map here. Things are starting to coalesce. Instead of a bunch of teeny tiny kingdoms, you're starting to get some medium kingdoms and even some large kingdoms starting to really coalesce. And so this is a period of political consolidation as well. All right, I mentioned this, but let's say it again. During this period, the Roman Church, the Western Church, the Roman Catholic Church, after the Reformation, reaches the zenith of its political and secular power. It will never be as powerful in Western Europe as it was during this time, for better or for worse. And there is better and there is worse. And part of the reason is that we do have a split between East and West at this point. And in the West, the Bishop of Rome is the undisputed patriarch that's left behind. So we talked about this map before. There were 4 great patriarchies in the East, and there was only one in the western half of the Roman Empire. So the Bishop of Rome had some outsized influence in half the empire. I talked about my church in Wichita being the only one on the west side of town, and there being 6 churches on the east side of town. So that gave us just some extra, we had more territory to draw from that was, unclaimed by others, if you will. So that's an important piece here. And in 1054, East and West split. Now, we have seen tension between the Eastern Church and the Western Church several times up until this point. The excuse for the presenting issue in 1054 was the fact that in Spain, blame the Spaniards, they added a word to the Nicene Creed. The original Nicene Creed did not have this word. The Spanish started using it. Was it Toledo? Yeah. In Toledo, and then it started catching on in the rest of Spain, and it started catching on the rest of Western Europe. And eventually the Roman Catholic side of Christianity, the Western side, started using it. And the Orthodox Greek side said, no, you cannot add to it. We've had this for 600 years. You can't touch it. The text needs to stay inviolate. So that extra word in Latin, it's one word. In our English translation, it's 3 words. It's the and the Son. The Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son, over in that part of the paragraph. In Latin, the one word is filioque, and the Son. So this is the presenting issue. This is kind of the final straw that breaks the camel's back. They get into a snit about this, and it's sometimes called the filioque controversy over the filioque clause as the final issue. Yeah, go ahead, Bob.
So it proceeds from the Father and the Son.
Yeah.
Did they add in worship and glorify also?
No, that was part of it. So the original Greek would be the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father, and with the Father and the Son, he is worshiped and glorified. All right. And you can actually make a good argument from the Gospel of John both ways, that the Spirit proceeds from the Son or the Spirit is only sent from the Father. And they were arguing over fine points of John's Gospel. We don't need to go into all the weeds on that one.
It's always confused me because with the Orthodox, because in their point where Jesus says, receive the Holy Spirit.
Jesus says that, and Jesus talks about the Spirit will speak for him and teach you, which is what the Western side of the church would argue. And the Greeks were not so much about saying, well, the Gospel of John really says their main position was we decided this, we said it, we don't tinker with it now. The Orthodox Church still regards itself as the unchanged, unaltered. Now they have had some alterations and changes, but that's their mindset that they have had. They received the unchanging deposit of the faith from the apostles, and they have not monkeyed with it for 2,000 years. And you Westerners, actually, they like us. They think we have monkeyed with things the least. Ironically, they like us more than the Roman Catholics and other Protestants. So, fascinatingly, we have a. We'll talk about that later.
There's also Greek versus Latin.
So some other things, as Jimmy pointed right ahead to. Good job. There were all those other underlying issues. So one side is Greek speaking, one is Latin speaking, and as we saw in some of the Trinity controversies, one side is Greek thinking, and the other is Latin thinking. And your vocabulary often determines how you'll define things. Eskimos have multiple words for snow. Polynesian Islanders have 0 words for snow. Okay, well, the crunchy snow, the hard snow, the fluffy snow, we don't even have a word. So your thinking gets determined by your vocabulary. That was a problem. Some things that weren't quite as essential, maybe, whether you should have leaven, yeast in your communion bread or not. East said yes, West eventually said no, which is why we have that fish food, those fish food wafers. As the joke goes, it's easier to believe that Jesus is in the bread than it is to believe that that fish food is bread. Yeah. So anyway, and the other question that the West was really pushing is, because Peter and Paul died in Rome, that gives us special standing amongst the rest of you. We are first amongst equals, or maybe we're first, period. And the other guys were saying, no, you're one of the big five. Level the playing field. And so that was an issue. Yeah, Bob.
Was that a real issue?
That probably is, when you really come down to it, that's probably what's upsetting them the most. And what's also going to be a problem then is if you don't have those other four resisting the Bishop of Rome, then he's going to be, once that's part of the system's gone, we'll see that in a minute here too. So what happened? The Pope was even dead at this time. They were in between popes, but the Pope's ambassadors in Constantinople were there to try to argue some of these things. They eventually got disgusted with the Archbishop of Constantinople, the Patriarch of Constantinople, and they walked into the church, the church, the cathedral, the big Hagia Sophia, which I showed pictures of, and during the middle of a communion service, slapped a bull of excommunication on the altar. I mean, can you imagine just somebody walking in right during the middle of a worship service and saying, you, the chief celebrant and bishop of this church, are excommunicated? Well, the patriarch thought about it for about 4 days, and he excommunicated all of them. And so that was the rift. And that was a split between East and West. Interestingly, in the 1960s, but in 1965, both sides got together and said, let's mutually remove those excommunications. Our guys were hot-headed 900 years ago, so let's nullify those. We'll start talking about how we might be able to be in dialogue. It took 900 years to get us to this point, so it might take centuries more, but so there's some hope these days. So they at least have nullified those mutual excommunications. But East and West at this point were split and have been split to this day here. All right, so what that does for us here, that's part of the reason that the Western Church during this time period will really reach its political zenith here. We don't have those Eastern bishops to be a regulation or a regulator, an opposite side, to give any kind of equilibrium by having balanced sides. It's unbalanced at this point. And the bishops of Rome have been pushing papal primacy for a while now, but the resistance has come from the East. No, that's ridiculous. Now that's not there anymore. Nobody's over there saying, So the claims that did not get traction for centuries will start getting traction during this time period. But the Pope's the number one guy. The Bishop of Rome is the number one guy. And remember, Pope is just a corruption of Papa. He's the big father, the big guy. But his real title is Bishop of Rome. All right. Another thing floating around during this time is they started leaning on a document that they had for a few centuries called the Donation of Constantine. What they did not know, apparently, perhaps, in the 1000s is that this document was a forgery. In the 1400s, they proved it was a forgery just based on the Latin that was used. Latin studies, humanism, Erasmus, the great scholar. Humanism was starting up, not secular humanism, that's a different thing, but the humanists were all staunch Christians, so don't let our later labels mess you up. But they realized it was a forgery. It was using Latin from the 700s or 800s, not Latin from the 200s or 300s. So this document, though, said, I, the Emperor Constantine, since I'm moving to Constantinople, bequeath all secular power to the Bishop of Rome, whom I'm leaving behind. Yeah, so that's a big deal. If that's a true document, that gives the Pope an enormous amount of power. Turns out not to be true document. It's a forgery, but they didn't have the literary tools at the time to parse that out. Oh, yeah, well, Latin and Greek. Constantine would have spoken both. Yeah. So, but it's based on a lie, based on a forgery. It's not their lie. It's been floating around for a while in the archives, but they pull it out of the archives and say, hey, let's use this. And 1054, they used it. They used it heavily in the centuries that followed there. So that's one big thing going on at this time. Another big thing is the investiture controversy. Who gets to pick popes? Who gets to pick bishops in another country? Does the Pope appoint everybody? Do the cardinals elect a pope like we do today? Or do the local kings appoint? This was a huge live issue. There were kings appointing popes and appointing bishops at the time, and the church started to really push back and say, no, it needs to be the church that does it. It's a matter of who gets their power from whom. The Pope crowned Charlemagne as king, but really didn't have much power to do that. It's more symbolic and a nice religious veneer. We open the presidential inaugurations in each session of the Senate and Congress with a prayer, but nobody thinks the chaplain's in charge of Congress. All right, but they were taking this seriously. Who's getting power from whom? Nice medieval woodcut here. The king is handing the crozier, the bishop's staff, to the bishop. Message is very clear. The bishop derives his power from the king. The bishop is under the king in this feudal system. The church pushes back on that. In fact, in 1075, Pope Gregory VII says flat out, simony, it's not simonize, simony is buying church positions with money. Pay a big enough fee to the king, and you can be appointed the dean of the cathedral. Or the rector of the parish or whatever, or cardinal, or, pay for play. So the fact that they had a word for it meant it was a fairly common occurrence. So simony is no longer legal. You can't buy a position. Of course, later on, the Borgia family, centuries later, would have all kinds of members in the church hierarchy, but we're not paying for it. Okay. So simony is illegal. Clerical marriage is made illegal. So this is one of the first times that clerical celibacy really gets kind of pushed in a legal way. Now, not all clergy became celibate right then. You read the studies, and every parish priest practically has a housekeeper, and the housekeeper might even live next door, live in the same house, and they might even have kids, and you kind of wink at that, but marriage is illegal for clergy. That's not so much about spirituality. Any guesses?
Keep them giving away church
Property. If you can't, no heirs, no problem passing things down. One thing that becomes an issue now, the Roman Catholic Church could probably get rid of clerical celibacy on theological grounds, but they have a huge practical problem now. They are not geared to have families on the payroll. Insurance for families, extra money, everything is set up for single male clergy. And so it would be an enormous systemic change if you made Episcopal type clergy, Catholic clergy, function like Episcopal or Methodist or Presbyterian ministers. Protestants are used to, picking up the tab for that. Roman Catholics are not.
What do they do now when, like, Episcopal clergy become Roman Catholic?
Well, you're not going to get the big parishes if you do that. You're allowed to do it. You're allowed to be married if you're bringing your wife in, but you can't get remarried if she dies. But you're not going to get any kind of benefits or salary, I think, that'll support that kind of system. Plus, folks that switch over from the Episcopal Church to the Roman Catholic Church never get the big slots. They're kind of tainted in some ways. They're second-class priests in some ways.
My brother-in-law and sister-in-law said the new priest that Holy Spirit wasn't Episcopal priest.
I don't know about that. Interesting. Could be.
But I
Could
don't
be.
know where it's from. But
I mean, Father Steve, who was here, switched over. So, so it does happen. It does happen.
And you also, with that too, the time of the family also takes over this.
I was told point blank when I was first ordained by the Catholic priest in town, I don't know how you guys do it. I'm running 24/7. How would you possibly do it if you had family? Well, that does. And my response was, I agree with you, Father Dennis. On the other hand, how can you really counsel a family in distress if you don't have any experience living? He said, well, I grew up in a family and, okay, well, yeah, okay. So there are pluses and minuses on both sides there. So clerical marriage, illegal. Lay investiture is also made illegal. That's kings picking clergy. So those three things were all made illegal. And by the way, he also throws in that papal power is absolute. There's no appeal to the Pope. And what's more, the Pope has power to get rid of kings and emperors that disagree with him. He can tell the country, you need a new king, and they should do that. Well, right away, he got pushback. The Holy Roman Emperor himself, Henry IV, said, no way. And the Pope said, fine. He pulled out the big guns. The big guns popes had were tools of excommunication. You, Henry, are no longer allowed to receive any sacraments in the church. You are cut off. And if you die, you will die in a state of sin and you're going to hell. Plus, they also had the big gun of, we can apply that to your whole country, hoping they'll rise up and overthrow you. That'll put some pressure on them. So your country is under interdict. Your country, nobody can have communion. Nobody can get married. Nobody can get baptized. It's a pretty big gun. No absolution of sins. You die with your sin. Okay. Given the medieval system of sacraments, their understandings of things, that's a big weapon to wield. And so Henry IV took a couple of years, but he eventually backed down in a very famous and humiliating way. He had to stand in the snow barefoot for 2 days in northern Italy, outside the Pope's door, Pope's gate, petitioning to come in and see the Pope. And I love the picture there. When he came in, it's kind of blurry, but a little hard to see. But the Pope is pointing, kneel down, and the two people here started going, right here, King, right here, Holy Roman Emperor, here's where you kneel down and kiss the papal ring. You need to subject yourself completely. So that tells you the Pope at this point is wielding some real political power. The king didn't buy that. And actually, there's some historians that say because Henry did that, his political power actually increased, but that's getting into the weeds here. But publicly, this is a pretty humiliating thing for the Holy Roman Emperor, who's supposed to be working. Yeah, Mark.
Was Henry located in Rome or at Constantinople?
Henry is up in the Germany. He's up in the Germany, Switzerland, that glom. Yeah, no, the Byzantine, the Eastern Empire, Eastern Roman Empire is still chugging along and will be for another 300 years or so, 275 years at this point, 450s. Anyway, so, but yeah, Henry is, by this point, the Holy Roman Empire has shifted from France to Germany and will stay there until the 1800s. The Habsburg dynasty, I think, is the last Holy Roman emperors, aren't they? I forget. Anyway, it's it'll last into the 1800s. All right, so also on these lines of investiture, Gregory's successor, quarter century later, wrote this treatise about the power of the papacy versus and the power of the state, the monarchs. They didn't have an idea of nation states the way we do. And he said the papacy is like the sun and monarchs are like the moon. Monarchs derive their light from the sun, just like the moon derives its light from the sun. So the monarchy gets its power from the papacy and from the church. And so we call the shots. And eventually there was a compromise statement made at a place called Worms, not Worms. It's a tough thing in English. It's called the Concordat of Worms, not to be confused with the Diet of Worms, which happens later in the Reformation. One of the great jokes of the Reformation is Diet of Worms looks like Diet of Worms. And there are plenty of... Oh, sorry, I thought my hair was messy. My wife is signaling like this. So diet, it's not a diet of worms, it's Diet of Worms. We'll get to that in the Reformation later on. But Concordat of Worms, the bottom line is the church can pick the clergy. Yes, the Pope is exactly right. We'll let the church do that. And any religious symbols involved, like a crozier, the bishop's staff, the church gets to present them. The ordaining archbishop or the Pope or whoever is in charge of the service on the church end gets to present all those symbols, rings, all that. If in the feudal system, the particular bishop or clergy person also has some secular lands, secular roles. Then the king can ascribe lesser secular tokens to represent that power, those symbols of authority. But the church authority to pick and the church authority to give the symbols of church authority rests only with the church. So that was the compromise here. And before we get off this and think, well, that really seems very ancient and weird, House of Lords. About 60% of English bishops sit in the House of Lords. Can you imagine 60% of the Episcopal bishops in this country sitting in the US Senate? That would be bizarre to us. But 60%, this is a recent picture. That's Justin Welby, current Archbishop of Canterbury. The lady bishop, I think she may be Gloucester. But anyway, they're socially distanced. This is a recent picture. They've got empty benches and stuff. They're still members of the House of Lords. So
Yeah.
well, when the Lords show up in their robes, and so the church, the bishops match with their robes. England is much more frou-frou. I mean, even the judges wear not just black robes, but wigs, and advocates wear wigs. And
I mean, I guess when they show us, footage and stuff like that,
we're seeing the House of Commons, which is, yeah, that's true.
House of Commons has the real power.
Right. House of Lords is, but bishops still sit in the House of Lords. And before we think, oh, those weird English, if you remember Watergate, there was a guy looked like this, part of Nixon's impeachment hearings. His father, Robert Drinan, he was a representative from Massachusetts. And interestingly, he had to give up his seat. He had to not run for re-election in 1980 because the Pope at that time, John Paul II, said no more clergy involved in secular offices. Now, that's quite the change from the 13 and 12 and 1100s when the popes were wielding power. The Pope said to Drinan and there was actually a guy from Wisconsin by that point later in 1980 who was a representative. They had to resign because no more. And I don't know if you may not remember, there was a Nicaraguan politician who was a priest and he had to back off and he didn't very nicely. And the Pope went to Nicaragua and the guy kneels before the Pope, and the Pope, John Paul, there are pictures of him scolded this guy publicly at the foot of the airplane stairs. So anyway, you get out of secular politics by clergy. So a real flip from the Middle Ages. Yeah. Yeah, he was involved in Nicaraguan politics. Yeah. Plus you had all the liberation theology stuff floating around there too. Right, but go ahead, Jimmy.
It was all, but in Bolivia, actually, recently, like in the last decade or two, one of the famous archbishops, actually, it was very popular with everyone, wanted to become president or was going to run for office as president, and they actually made him, and he decided to go ahead and become a layperson again. He
renounced his orders in order to run in Bolivia. So yeah. That's interesting. I didn't know that, but okay. So that's a hard and fast rule with the Roman Catholic Church now, and they're sticking with it apparently. So, all right. And before we get to all those Roman Catholics and those House of Lords, we have Senator John Danforth. If you don't know, Senator Danforth is one of the smartest guys around. He graduated from Yale Law School in 1963. At the same time, he graduated from Yale Divinity School. Danforth is an Episcopal priest. If you remember the Ronald Reagan funeral at the National Cathedral, Danforth is officiating. In fact, I love that picture up top. He's got two bishops that were the assistants in the service, bishops of Washington, and Danforth is the lead celebrant of that service and the preacher. Episcopal priest and senator. Okay, well, interesting. So we don't have a lot of clergy in politics. I did have a friend, retired dean of the cathedral in Kansas, that ran for the U.S. House after he retired. Did not win primary, but it's possible. It's possible. All right, another thing going on during this time. Courts. The church really pushed that clergy, in order to not be under the influence of the king too much, not letting the monarchy have any kind of sway over the church, the clergy needed to be tried separately by church courts and not secular courts. And they really pushed that. And Interestingly, if you remember the story of Thomas Beckett, dear friend of King Henry II of England, one of his chief advisors. And then Henry said, I'm going to make Thomas my Archbishop of Canterbury. And Thomas fell in love with the church at that point and fell in love with God and became a thorn in his old friend's side. And one of the chief flashpoints for the two of them was this idea of clergy being tried in separate courts. And eventually Henry made the aside to a few of his knights, will nobody rid me of this troublesome priest? And they whipped out their swords and marched to Canterbury Cathedral and whacked him right in the cathedral. As the story goes, an acolyte tried to defend him with a crucifix, a processional cross. But yeah, processional cross against swords, not much of a contest. And so Saint Thomas of Becket now, Thomas Becket got sorted down and made a saint just within a few years after that. So
Henry also expressed regret.
he did. He had to go humiliate himself. In fact, if you watch the movie Beckett with Peter O'Toole playing Henry II, he also plays Henry II in Lion in Winter. Interesting, same character, same actor, different part of his life. But he has to go and get whipped by some monks as penance at Canterbury Cathedral in front of Thomas's tomb a couple of years later. So that's where the movie opens. Thomas's Revenge. Richard Burton plays Thomas Becket. It's a great movie. My favorite scene is when they're coming to arrest him, and the knight is coming in, pulling his sword out. This is before he gets killed later, but sheathe your sword or impale your immortal soul upon it. If you don't put your sword back, you're going to hell. That's the power they were wielding at this time, in theory. And just one, before we think that's too weird, there are some legal degrees that have LLs, LLBs, LLDs, LLMs. I don't think they're used very much in this country anymore, Bob, are they?
No. Well, Texas.
Okay.
There is the still when you plead, and plead is called prayer. Request all other relief, both legal and equitable, to which they show themselves entitled. Because at some point in time, the Commonwealth, the merging of courts of law and ecclesiastical courts of equity occurred. So it's
You still have a remnant in that.
that there were ecclesiastical courts.
So if you didn't read the slide, the LLs represent that you're astute and trained in two kinds of law, canon and civil, which of course, I don't know any canon law classes in most law schools now, but I could be educated on that. Seminaries, they do, yeah. And I had a friend who was actually a Roman Catholic monk that switched to the Episcopal Church, and he was a law professor, and kept getting tickets, which was hilarious, but that's another story. Okay, so at this point, that's a lot of civil power going on here. The other thing I wanted to kind of close with is a talk about another kind of resurgence. There was a gigantic building boom during this period. When you tour Europe, the great cathedrals of Europe, most of them are built in this time period. There are some that burned down. I mean, Coventry Cathedral famously was bombed by the Nazis. They left the shell up and built a new cathedral right next door to it. Some were torn down. St. Peter's in Rome was torn down and rebuilt in the Renaissance. But many of the great churches you'll visit, and Notre Dame had the big fire, but it was built in this time period. So there's a big building boom. And one of the goals was, if you look at some of those small towns, the church just dominates the skyline. The old thing about, what dominates your skyline tells what your town's like. Even some West Texas towns, might be a Baptist church, not a Roman Catholic church, but Rhineland has a giant Roman Catholic church sitting out in the middle of the farmland, basically. The most important thing in town is the biggest thing. And so, in the old days, churches, then a lot of places in West Texas, grain elevators or courthouses. So civil, and in big cities these days, it's commerce. I mean, it's skyscrapers. I mean, much bigger than any church could ever be. All right, but back then, they wanted to have the skyline. How high could you go to the glory of God and to lift people's thoughts heavenwards? So they had two styles of architecture that came about in this time. The first was Romanesque. And what they were trying to do with Romanesque architecture was combine the shape of the old Roman basilicas with some of the round features of Byzantine architecture, incorporate some of the dominess of Byzantine stuff. So if you remember, the old basilicas were shaped like this, and that's Hagia Sophia. That's one of the pinnacles of Byzantine churches, domes, and it's also square instead of long. Now they kept the longness, the long axis in Romanesque architecture, but started adding some arching and vaulting and things like that that pulled in some of the circularity. So Romanesque facade, look at that. I mean, compare that to, this is the old St. Peter's Basilica. Look at the shape, just end on, and the Romanesque Cathedral in Pisa. I mean, it's just same kind of shape, end on. So yeah, there, I should have gone to there. I put them together. And there's you have these rounded arches that you see in there. You still have a rounded apse where the altar is at the end, like we have at St. Paul's. We are a neo-colonial building, neo-Georgian building, but we have a round apse added on, which is not typical of colonial architecture, Georgian architecture. Red brick, white painted wood, that's typical. White interiors, that's typical. Another story. So Romanesque, another Romanesque church here. Notice all the arches or windows are all rounded. Inside, they have these round archways. And part of the problem with Romanesque architecture, if you wanted to go up and gain altitude, gain height, you had to thicken your pillars and thicken your walls. And so often the bigger Romanesque churches will have more blank wall space than the next thing that's coming, or the churches that were shorter. So you have these blank walls. Part of what they did with those is frescoes and painting became a way of decorating those bigger walls that we have. We got to thicken the walls, we got to thicken the pillars. So we'll put paintings on this blank space. But you do see the roundness. If you look down these two churches, you've got roundness in a couple different ways. You've got some domey architecture there in a couple different ways. Some straight barrel vaulting, straight vaulting, and some more fancier vaulting. My son-in-law is the architect, not me, but he could tell you probably more than you want to know about that. So that's Romanesque. Romanesque peaked in 1150, and it was peaking even as it was being supplanted on the fringes by Gothic style. And there are some churches that are blends. You can see a transition if you're really into it. But before we get to that, I want to just say Romanesque, there was a Romanesque revival. There's still Romanesque buildings that get built occasionally. A couple I've shown you before. This Church of Perpetual Aeration in Clyde, Missouri, the Nuns Convent. Beautiful Romanesque building. It wasn't built in the late 1800s in Missouri, but beautiful Romanesque building. Very, very Romanesque in its architecture, including mosaics and frescoes. And the monks down the road I talked about too, they're in a Romanesque building as well. And they've got beautiful, beautiful frescoes that they'll put on the Christmas cards they sell. And wonderful Romanesque buildings. So they're still around. You still have them. But as we said, that the thickening of pillars, that thickening of walls meant that the churches got a little darker, a little heavier feeling. And so Gothic tried to push back against that. And they did that in a remarkable engineering feat. They said, instead of thickening the walls to add more support, let's slap some support on the outside of the building. We're going to put the support outside the structure so that we can lighten up what's inside the worship space. And so that's what Gothic cathedrals do. And so Gothic cathedrals are known for their flying buttresses, their external supports, and they've also got pointed windows and pointed arches, which allow them to support more weight than a round arch top. And so the pointiness and the flying buttresses. So you see the extra supports on the outside of the cathedral. On this one, some elaborate ones there. I mean, look how high that one goes. And you can really get some height, not only in the spires, but also in the building. And you get all this external support there. Kind of clutters up the external part of it, but it does add the ability to go higher. Now from the front, Notre Dame, for example, from the front, you don't notice it, but from the back and the sides, you do notice it. The supports are not visible so much from the front profile, but they're very visible if you walk to the side of the church. They're big. Now it's not they're kind of they're not heavy and stout in the way we think of heaviness. There's still some thinness to them, but one thin plus some thin out here equals thick as far as support goes. So brilliant engineering solution. Another one there. Beautiful flying buttresses, and they decorate them and put little fancy frou-frous and curls and little stone carvings on them. But this one has some arches. It's a double buttress with arches, Gothic arches in between. It's very interesting. I don't know if that's structural or decorative or what. But what that does for the inside of your church is this. It opens things up. It allows more light. Instead of having solid wall here, you can have colonnades and archways, and you have windows on the other side there. And so it really, really opens things up. And you see the pointiness of the space here. Couple other Gothic church interiors here. Again, we're getting pointier at the tops and lots of lighting. Sainte-Chapelle, some of the most beautiful stained glass anywhere in France, in the world. It's a shorter church, but I'll show you a close up of that. That's England. That's Salisbury Cathedral. They've got a very modern baptismal font right in the foreground and modern chairs. People would have stood in the church back then, but very, very light. I mean, you don't get the heavy feel that you get from those Romanesque churches. It's much, much airier, much more open, and you can get higher. You can build higher spaces. And of course, stained glass became popular during this time period. And that's Sainte-Chapelle around the altar. Just glorious, glorious stained glassery. All right. Gothic peaked in about 1250, but Gothic had a revival also in the 19th and 20th centuries. And so you still see a lot of Gothic churches around. Colonial churches dominated the skyline during colonial times, Georgian churches, ones that look like St. Paul's. But then in the late 1800s and early 20th century, Gothic churches started sprouting up all over the place. Think of this one, Washington National Cathedral, a pure 20th century building, started in the first decade or so, started in 1909 and finished in the 1990s. So it's completely 20th century, and yet, it's probably our most famous Episcopal building in the country. And very Gothic. You got Gothic arches, you've got Gothic roof, you got flying buttresses on the outside, and you've got beautiful, light, airy stained glass, all of that. So beautiful Gothic building, and there are others as well. Closer in the Episcopal Church, Abilene. Heavenly Rest is a Gothic church. It's not as tall. In fact, you can't see on this. I can see on my picture a car roof. You can barely see it here for scale. Heavenly Rest is not gigantic. In fact, it's modeled on English Cathedral, and they didn't have copy machines at the time, but they basically shrunk it. It's like a third scale English Cathedral. They just shrunk it down, and it's a lovely church. Some of you may have been in it. Lovely, lovely little church. It's one of the two biggest churches in our diocese. Lovely, little compared to European cathedrals. And before I get off the subject real quick, there's also in America a wooden expression of Gothic architecture called Prairie Gothic or Carpenter Gothic. On the right is an Episcopal church. There are lots of Prairie Gothic Episcopal churches. On the left, Gordon, I did this for you, not this Gordon, but the other Gordon Wilkerson. It's a Baptist church. So lovely Prairie Gothic Baptist church or Carpenter Gothic Baptist church. It is in Massachusetts. So it's probably American Baptist or Northern Baptist, not Southern Baptist, but and I can't.
Looks like the St. Paul down by the Arboretum.
I was going to say that. Our first building, exactly. It's Prairie Gothic, Carpenter Gothic. I love the priest standing out in front of the door there in that little picture. But yeah, very much. In my very first church, I had 3 churches, and 2 of them were built in the 19-teens and 1913, 1917. Very similar, wooden, Gothic. Structurally, you don't need a pointed Gothic arched window to support anything, but the look of it, that says church. We got to have this Gothic look to be church, even out on the plains. So fascinating. Well, next week, we'll deal with some controversies the church was facing, and we're going to flip that for 2 weeks. Next week, we're going to deal with medieval monasticism and also with the rise of universities and also some of sacramental theology and other theological stuff that was big that kind of goes along with universities. And then we'll do some controversies and crusades the third week in December. So any thoughts or questions here? Got a minute or two. Yeah, Trey.
You went to my dad's funeral. That's a Gothic.
I would, my memory of it, yeah, in Colorado Springs, I think it's very much a Gothic church. All stone, and I think it had Gothic arches and everything. Yeah, very. And the fanciest men's room I've ever seen in any church anywhere. I couldn't believe the urinals at that church and the stalls. Yeah, that part was not original. Like you could tell that had been remodeled, but yeah. What church is that in Colorado Springs? It's got a double name.
Yeah, Grace and St. Stephen.
Grace and St. Stephen's Episcopal Church, because it was merged.
Split in the early part of the 20th century, and then they reconciled, but they kept both names.
Kept both names. Okay. Fascinating history. Grace and St. Stephen's. We had St. Stephen's and St. Albans that merged in Wichita, and I suggested they should be Church of the Bleeding Martyrs because both of them were martyrs ended bloodily, but they didn't take me up on that. Yeah, Gordon.
St. David's in downtown Austin, is that Gothic?
I would suspect so. I
think it-
yeah, they've got those beautiful Tiffany stained glass windows. I can't imagine it not being Gordon.
Dark wood. in the
Yeah, there's
sanctuary.
some wooden things there too, though. Yeah. Of course, neo-Gothic, you could build short neo-Gothic. The old St. Andrew's Amarillo was a shorter neo-Gothic type of building. It was high, but not European cathedral high. By stretch of imagination.
So the Sistine Chapel Romanesque.
It's actually-
That's a-
That's 16, but I don't know if that is-
Yeah, St. Peter's is going to be Baroque, but the Sistine Chapel itself, that may be a Roman. That's a good question, Gordon. I'm trying to think what the structures are kind of round. The ceiling's kind of round vaulting on top, isn't it?
Well, we're talking about first.
Yeah.
I don't remember.
Yeah, that may be, I'm not sure the history when that was built compared to the rest of the Vatican complex, if that was an older chapel too, and that's a great question. Yeah, David.
When I've been in Europe and gone through all these big fancy cathedrals, especially in Ireland, I was hearing about the times that they were built and how the people were living. And it always bothers me to think how far that got away from what Christ taught. And I guess politics and hubris took precedent over Christ's teachings during that time.
In some ways, I mean, part of the trade-off of building any building for a church is, could we be using this money for something else? And that goes for St. Paul's or First Baptist or, First Methodist downtown. We have that struggle. And the other struggle is what your motivation is when you're building it. Are you doing it for the glory of God or the glory of man? There are undoubtedly some medieval architects that didn't really care about the glory of God. They wanted to get their building up high. But the towns were also very much involved. A lot of times it was, so we can glorify God by building this big building. We will give of our money in order to do that. And they weren't rich folks, medieval peasants. And so one of the pushbacks later on, that's a seed for the Reformation, is they're trying to collect money to rebuild St. Peter's in Rome. And they use some pretty sleazy fundraising tactics to do it. We'll get to that later on. But that's a constant, push and pull with the church. There are folks now, there is a movement within Christianity across denominations that says maybe we should go back to meeting in movie theaters and use the money we save from owning a building to do works out in the world, to do Christ's work. And so, that's a constant thing. And, the stuff we use on the altar is fancy. We don't have gold chalices, but we do have silver chalices. But some of them have gold lining.
The main part of the reasoning was that if back to the peasants, if you give all this and your labor and all this, you may be miserable here, but you'll go to heaven.
Right, and that especially will become a problem in the Reformation. I mean, and so that will be one of the flashpoints of the Protestant Reformation. That's one of the things that has Luther so upset. Luther did not intend to start a separate church or a separate religious movement. He just wanted the Roman Catholic Church, his church, to stop doing that. And when they said, nope, we're not going to, and pushed him back. And yeah, anyway, we'll get to that in the spring here, in February probably. Any other thoughts here? All right, y'all. Well, we'll stop there and pick up with monasteries and universities next week.
And